Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining the Department of Energy's webinar series on the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff. I'm Kelly Cummins. I'm the Deputy Director of our Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And today I'm joined by several senior DOE leaders to discuss the Carbon Management Liftoff Report. These liftoff reports represent a department-wide initiative to strengthen engagement between the public and private sectors to accelerate the commercialization and deployment of critical clean energy technologies. These investments DOE makes in commercializing technology in the coming years must catalyze roughly $100 billion in private capital formation across more than 20 clean energy technologies and sectors to achieve market liftoff. As we like to say, this effort is private sector led, government enabled, and even more importantly, government accelerated. And these liftoff reports are our way of highlighting what we're hearing from the private sector on their willingness to invest in deploying these critical technologies. To stay relevant to the issues capital allocators are facing in each sector, the liftoff reports are living documents that will be regularly updated as we gather additional input from industry and the commercialization outlook evolves. The Pathways to Commercial Liftoff effort began with four technology areas. Number one, advanced nuclear. Number two, clean hydrogen. Number three, long duration energy storage. And then number four, what we're here to talk about today, carbon management. All of the liftoff reports can be found at www.liftoff.energy.gov, which has the four liftoff reports I just mentioned, as well as all of the previously recorded webinars that provide a deep dive on each of these technology areas. In addition to today's discussion on carbon management, future liftoff webinars are planned throughout the year with industrial decarbonization coming up next. Now I have the privilege of introducing our speakers. Joining us today, we have Brad Crabtree, who is the Assistant Secretary at the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Vanessa Chan, who is our Chief Commercialization Officer, as well as the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions, and Jigar Shah, who is the Director of the Loan Programs Office. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and let's get started. All right, for my first question, I'm going to turn to Brad. Brad, carbon management is a pretty broad term. Could you describe how DOE defines carbon management and its role in the energy transition?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. Carbon management represents a really broad portfolio of technologies and infrastructure across an entire value chain. So you have carbon capture of CO2 emissions from power plants and industrial facilities. You have carbon conversion, which is the conversion of those captured carbon emissions into useful products. You have carbon removal, which is an more emerging field of technologies where you're actually removing CO2 that's already been emitted to the atmosphere. And then there's CO2 transport, which is transporting the CO2 from where it's captured to where it can be permanently geologically stored or put to some sort of use. And then finally, geologic storage itself. This is kind of a chicken and egg deployment challenge because you have this entire value chain. So at DOE, thanks to the policies and programs we have, we're implementing deployment across that value chain, ideally at the same time. The overall purpose of the whole carbon management effort, though, is to capture CO2 from where we do not want it, which is in the atmosphere, or to prevent it from being released to the atmosphere, and get that carbon to where we do want it, which is safely and permanently stored deep underground in geologic formations, or again, turned into products. There's a long history to carbon management. It began in 1972 in West Texas here in the United States. We've actually been investing at DOE in carbon management since 1997. It's one of the areas of DOE's work that has enjoyed the broadest bipartisan support, and it spans multiple presidential administrations. And evidence of that support is this work has continued to grow over time. At the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, we work on all aspects of the value chain, funding research, development, and demonstration, providing technical assistance, and increasingly in partnership with the other offices on this webinar, supporting commercial scale deployment. I guess what I'd note that's really important here is that even with rapid electrification, both from renewables and nuclear energy build out, carbon management is going to be absolutely essential to accomplish our energy transition and meet our climate goals. You'll see in this study in this report a number of studies cited. They all find that carbon management is going to be required for a substantial and necessary portion of the emissions reductions we need to reach net zero by mid-century. So what that means, bottom line, is we're going to have to be capturing and storing hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide every year. And so it's a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. And we're excited to be working with the Office of Technology Transitions, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and our Loan Program Office to implement these technologies and the infrastructure they need at scale.
Thanks, Brad, and couldn't agree with you more. It is a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So let me direct this question to Vanessa. So Vanessa, this is the fourth Liftoff report that DOE has published. In your mind, what makes carbon management similar or different from the other technologies covered in the other reports?
Well, first of all, I would say that the thing that's common for all four reports is that a lot of work has gone into it, and we partner with the private sector in order to really get those perspectives in. And with all these reports, what we found is that there are some that are ready for liftoff. That is, the technology, the market, and policy environment is all there to get the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars out of capital deployed. Or that in some cases, the industry is a little bit stuck, kind of like the catch-22 that we've heard, and is not on track. So for advanced nuclear and long duration energy storage, there are a couple of things that are holding us back from full liftoff. In the case of carbon management like hydrogen, it's actually ready for a liftoff story. As Brad mentioned, we've been working on this for decades. So we've got the technology, we've got the policy, we've got the workforce, and we've got the natural resources. So our sense is that carbon management is on track for the first tens of billions of capital formation over the next years. But one thing that really makes carbon management unique is that the value proposition or the business proposition for carbon management looks very different from the other technologies. In the case of nuclear and hydrogen, we're actually selling and making a commodity. In long duration energy storage, it's also a power markets play. Carbon management is a little bit more like waste management or pollution control than compared to the other technologies. And these are the business models that we really need to think about, is how do we actually create a business model the market is ready to adopt. It also can play a very significant role in decarbonizing the industrial sector. So we're also going to look at that in the context too in an upcoming Liftoff report on industrial decarbonization that's set to come out later this year. Because in the end, carbon management really is a critical enabler for technologies and sectors such as the industrial decarbonization.
Thanks, Vanessa. And you mentioned the policy environment, so I want to pull that string a little bit. So Brad, if I can go back to you, the Liftoff report says that we're looking at a once-in-a-generation opportunity for carbon management, given the current policy environment and the market environment. Can you say a little bit more about the opportunity at hand?
Absolutely. I think it's actually really difficult to overstate the impact of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. I would go so far to say it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I've worked on carbon management at the federal and state level for 20 years, and candidly, it's been very challenging for the reasons Vanessa mentioned, the business model challenges. It's been very hard to advance commercial scale deployment of carbon management. But it's not just business model. Contrary to widespread perceptions, carbon management until very recently hasn't actually had the level of federal policy support that other clean energy technologies have enjoyed. And we've seen the results of that policy support. But again, now we're looking at a very different environment. The Inflation Reduction Act has streamlined and enhanced the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture and storage. It's now $85 per metric ton. It's the most significant incentive in the world for carbon capture and storage. It's $180 a ton for direct air capture, which again is a more emerging technology. The bottom line is that for those technologies that have higher concentration streams of CO2 emissions and therefore lower costs of capture, just thanks to the 45Q tax credit alone, they're poised to deploy rapidly in significant scale. In some cases, we will see, thanks to carbon management and some of these industries, a significant percentage of their total emissions abated. And this includes industries like ethanol, fertilizer, gas processing, and hydrogen production from natural gas in this instance. For those higher cost sectors that have lower concentrations of CO2 in their emissions, this includes all manner of heavy industry and fossil power generation. There, the infrastructure bill really comes in with $12 billion over 5 years dedicated to carbon management. A lot of those funds are going to support commercial scale demonstration of technologies in those sectors where we haven't yet demonstrated those technologies. And there's a case where we're working very closely with the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration, the Loan Program Office, and other offices to do that implementation. But these are first of a kind deployments of the technology in these sectors. If you net it all out, take the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, the honest answer is we don't know yet what the full deployment potential is, but there are some estimates. One of them suggests that in carbon management alone, by 2035, these two pieces of legislation could result in 250 to 250 million metric tons of CO2 emissions reductions. That's an enormous, very climate relevant contribution by any measure. The other thing that's exciting, and you'll hear this throughout this discussion today, is that the market is responding to this policy framework. We've long had, for a number of years now, 12 commercial scale operating carbon capture projects in the United States across multiple industries. Now, because of this policy framework, there's over 100 publicly announced projects under development and many, many more that are in the pipeline but not yet announced. And as Vanessa noted, there's tens of billions of dollars of private capital already being mobilized. And this will just build on the market leadership our country already has in this sector. We have enormous geologic potential, low-cost energy to power these systems. And thanks to the oil and gas industry and a number of other industries, we have a highly experienced workforce that's ready to go. So this is just a really exciting moment, I think, for all of us involved in this field.
Yes, very exciting indeed. And you touched a little bit about the different sectors, but I'm going to turn to Jigger for this question. The Liftoff report found that it makes financial sense to put carbon capture on approximately 100 million tons per year or so of CO2 emissions across a few sectors. Which areas does that include, Jigger?
Thanks, Kelly. I think when you think about the industries where it's easiest to process first, as Brad suggested, ethanol is a classic example here where the process stream coming off the facility is essentially pure CO2. So for those industries where you can capture the CO2 very cheaply and just stick it right into a pipeline into a Class VI well, you're really seeing a lot of benefits. So for an ethanol plant, their all-in cost to capture, transport, and store CO2 comes in well below the $85 a ton they can get from the 45Q tax credit. So they're moving quickly. Then on top of that, those ethanol plants can take advantage of a lower carbon intensity score by selling into the California low carbon fuel standard market. So if you own an ethanol plant, it really is a no-brainer right now to add carbon capture to your facility. And a lot of the biggest projects we see in the space right now are based on capturing CO2 from ethanol plants. And then with a couple of industries that are like that today, where it's pretty cheap to capture emissions, as Brad suggested, we're looking at about 100 million tons per year of deployment that we'd expect to happen between now and 2030.
Thanks, Jigger. Vanessa, for those other sectors where the economics are potentially trickier right now, what is the potential for cost reductions for point source capture or for engineered carbon dioxide removal like direct air capture? And how is DOE thinking about supporting those cost downs?
So cost downs for any technology commercialization is really critical because the lower cost it is, the easier it is for us to deploy. And so we see a lot of potential for cost downs from learning by doing improvements on solvent-based capture technology that's already pretty broadly used. I mean, that's what's great about the technology. It's been around for a while. We're also seeing novel capture technologies like advanced sorbents, membranes, and cryogenic approaches or alter processes like oxy-combustion that are really targeting significant cost declines that would move a lot of carbon management applications into the black if they work out, which is really exciting. So there's a real role for R&D here, and DOE is funding both the R&D and the deployment-led innovation through supporting first-of-a-kind projects. Now, you can't forget that the revenue side of this is also super critical. We think steel makers who make low embodied emissions iron and steel through CCS will probably be able to sell that for premium to buyers like automakers who have announced big emission reduction goals. But right now, we're not seeing that kind of firm long-term contracts allow developers to receive the financing against those potential revenues. And this is really the catch-22 or the chicken and the egg that Brad talked about that we really have to figure out how to crack. And this need for more bankable offtake agreements is also something we're seeing in the hydrogen space. And so we're looking really hard at what we can do to solve some of these demand side issues, because in the end, we need people to be buying what we're selling in order for this to work.
Thanks, Vanessa. And yes, demand side is incredibly important for all of our activities. Brad, back over to you. Your office administers the Carbon Safe program in coordination with the National Energy Technology Laboratory, which is aiming to unlock commercial scale geologic storage by developing sites from pre-feasibility to injection. And your office also administers a carbon conversion program, which transforms captured carbon oxides into valuable commodities and materials. How do you think about the appropriate roles of carbon storage and carbon conversion?
Well, so the biggest role is for geologic storage of CO2. So let me start there. And I hope if there's one thing that folks take away from my comments, there's a perception out there that's widely held, but incorrect, that geologic storage is something new and it's still unproven. And like carbon capture, our experience goes back decades. Globally, we have captured and stored geologically over 250 million tons of CO2 to date. And in the US alone, we've transported and injected well over 1 billion tons of CO2 into the subsurface. Now, in the case of the US, a lot of that CO2 is injected for the purposes of recovering oil. But what it means is we know how to manage CO2 at scale, both the transport of the CO2 and the injection and storage of it. And so we have a real potential here to implement storage at truly climate scale. Our Carbon Safe program now, which goes back many, many years, is now being expanded with the infrastructure bill funding, and we're now in position to co-invest with industry in the build out of large-scale regional CO2 transport and storage infrastructure hubs. And the goal of these hubs is so you can get past having one facility with carbon capture, one pipeline, and one geologic storage site, but really support a whole industrial ecosystem on a regional scale. And we anticipate through this funding to be able to support 20 to 40 regional geologic storage hubs. Each of those hubs will have to be able to store at least 50 million tons of CO2 over a 30-year period. We already have proposals coming in that we're supporting that propose hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 storage over that time frame. So there's an enormous potential for taking today's CO2 emissions and storing them permanently and safely. That said, not all CO2 emissions will be stored. In some cases, there will still be regions where we have industrial facilities or power plants that are economically just too distant from an appropriate geologic storage site. And so the ability to take that CO2 and use it as a feedstock and convert that CO2 into valuable products, things like low carbon or zero carbon chemicals, fuels, building materials, plastics, even things like bioproducts, those are all possibilities. But it's not just as an alternative to storage. This is a growing economic and jobs opportunity in its own right. There's a whole range of technologies and business models for converting CO2 emissions that are flourishing right now. And so it's a really exciting area of innovation and opportunity. And it not only provides, as I said, climate benefits, but also a real opportunity for certain industries and regions of the country to foster further economic development.
Thanks, Brad. And the new infrastructure is exciting, but you can't talk about infrastructure without talking about permitting. So Jigger, the Liftoff report found that many in industry voiced concerns about permitting timelines, especially for geologic storage facilities. What is it going to take to permit all of the CO2 storage that we need to achieve commercial liftoff?
Well, the key permit here is what's known as the Class 6 injection permit out of EPA that allows you to inject CO2 deep underground. A couple of these permits have taken 3+ years for past projects, so developers understandably get concerned that that's what's going to be a big issue for their project. The administration is aware that industry sees this as a key bottleneck, and we're already starting to see some movement here. Congress provided funding to EPA to support the Class 6 program and to help states who want to process Class 6 applications through primacy. EPA has said that they're targeting 2 years from receipt of a complete application to the issuance of a permit, and they've put together some tools to help streamline that process. And more states are applying for primacy to implement the Class 6 process themselves. EPA recently proposed a final rule to approve Louisiana's primacy application, and Louisiana is where a lot of the proposed projects are right now.
Thanks, Jigger. I would also note that the Liftoff report says that DOE has many tools to address the remaining challenges to widespread carbon management deployment. Brad, you've had some recent announcements lately. Can you mention some of those from your office and what DOE is doing broadly on that front?
I sure can. You know, the infrastructure bill is an incredible investment in technology and infrastructure, and that also includes carbon management in addition to many other priority technology pathways. In the area of carbon management, recently, we're working closely with your office, Kelly, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, on the large-scale carbon capture demos and pilots programs, as well as the regional direct air capture hubs. These are world-class large-scale initiatives to accelerate the development of the technology at commercial scale. We recently, I should say OSED recently selected 8 projects to support for FEED studies that will then feed into this demos program. And we have to, based on the statute, we have the opportunity to support at least 6 commercial scale demos going forward. So that's very exciting. On the CO2 transport side, we're working very closely with Jigger and his team at the Loan Programs Office. What's called CIFIA, that's the Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance Program. So we not only have in the federal government a transportation infrastructure program and a water infrastructure program, we now have a carbon infrastructure program. It's super exciting. And we just announced funding for feed studies there, $9 million for CO2 transport feed studies. And then finally, on storage, we've announced nearly $250 million to support 9 projects. Again, I mentioned the regional geologic storage hubs. The first 9 have received their initial grants of support, or awards of support, I should say, from the Carbon Safe program. So we're moving forward with implementation on the CO2 storage front as well.
A lot of great activity and certainly more news to come over the next few months. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Brad. Vanessa, I'll turn to you for this one. Equity and community benefits have been a big part of the conversation around carbon management. How does this play into DOE's approach for deployment?
Yeah, equity and community benefits is critical to this administration, full stop. And we have to be showing that these demonstration projects are delivering tangible long-term benefits to local environments and local economies, especially in disadvantaged communities that have long borne the brunt of diminished economic opportunities and disproportionate levels of pollution. This is something that is well known. So to be successful with this deployment agenda, there has to be a much greater emphasis on community and stakeholder engagement, workplace standards, workforce development, diversity, equity, inclusion, and Justice 40 commitments. And the community benefit plans are now required across all the bill and IRA funding opportunities. That's how important it is. And our office is actively working with labor, community organizations, environmental justice experts, and industry to really make sure we're developing the resources and the best practices. And I know folks like Brad's team at FECM have been engaging on the ground around the country where project development is expected to occur. It's really like on the ground execution. And we want to ensure that the community and stakeholder participation are addressing community concerns and increasing awareness about funding and other opportunities. So for all of DOE's funding opportunities, we're really making sure that the projects are being very thoughtful about how they're going to work with their host communities to maximize benefits and minimize potential risks. And in fact, at liftoff.energy.gov, which is a website we want everyone to go to, we have a cross-cutting report that is just on societal considerations and impacts and how we're thinking about it across this administration. So please go to liftoff.energy.gov to check out carbon management as well as this cross-cutting report.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I can't say enough that this is something that the whole department is focused on across all of our programs. So I want to thank everyone who joined us here today. The Liftoff report has truly been a team effort. These Liftoff reports are coordinated with experts in the technologies across the department, including the Office of Technology Transitions, my office, the Clean Energy Demos Office, the Loan Programs Office, the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office. Again, to view the Liftoff report discussed here today, liftoff.energy.gov. And I especially want to thank Brad, Jigger, and Vanessa for joining today and sharing their perspectives on what it will take to move this vital technology forward. And with that, I will hand it over to Rory and Ramsey to walk through the detailed findings of the report.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and hello to everyone on the line. I also just want to echo really quickly Kelly's gratitude to all of our DOE leadership that joined us for the question and answer portion of our webinar today. My name is Rory Jacobson. I'm a senior advisor in the Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And over the past few months, I've had the privilege of working on our Carbon Management Liftoff report with my colleague Ramsey Foss and many others from across the Department of Energy and industry. We're excited to share our findings with everyone online today and those who watch later online via the recording on our website. As a reminder, you can download the full report and rewatch these webinars at liftoff.energy.gov, as Vanessa mentioned. Before we dig in, I also want to reemphasize Kelly's opening comment that these reports are living documents. So we are already working to update our findings, and we welcome additional feedback. You will find a link to contact us at the same website, liftoff.energy.gov. And with that, let's dive into our findings.
Thanks, Rory. And hello to everyone on the line. I'm Ramsey Foss, a policy advisor and contractor at the department, who is part of the team that put this report together. So we'll start out with a bit of an overview of what we looked at when we went out to write this report. As Brad mentioned earlier, carbon management refers to a pretty broad range of technologies, and it's all about getting carbon dioxide from someplace we don't want it to someplace we do want it. And that all starts with capturing carbon dioxide, whether that's from point sources or from the atmosphere. So we focused on a range of point source capture and atmospheric capture that you can see on the screen here, but it was impossible to be exhaustive on all of the places where you can capture CO2 from point sources or the atmosphere. Now, once you've captured the CO2, you generally have to transport it to someplace else. This report focused mostly on pipelines, which today account for the highest volumes of CO2 transport at the lowest cost. But there are lots of other transportation methods as well, including rail, truck, and barge, and they'll all have a role to play here too. Finally, you've got to store the CO2 permanently or convert it into a useful product. Again, we looked at a few of the biggest methods to do that today, but we were not fully exhaustive here. So with that table setting, let's get into some of the findings. As Brad was saying, carbon management is going to play a critical role in the energy transition in the US. We looked at several studies, but this graphic here shows the range encompassed in two prominent studies in the literature. We'll need to capture and store or use anywhere from 400 million tons of CO2 per year in a low case scenario to 1.8 billion tons of CO2 per year in a high case scenario to reach US net zero goals. Obviously, this is a pretty broad range. The low end represents a pathway in which other decarbonization technologies become more cost-effective or deployable. So that's a scenario where advanced nuclear, hydrogen, long-duration energy storage, and other decarbonization technologies see more deployment than carbon management. The high case for carbon management represents a pathway in which those other technologies do not deploy to their full potential, and the cost and difficulty of deploying carbon management technologies decreases, thus making it a more viable option against those other technologies. It's worth noting that this range, this 400 million to 1.8 billion ton per year range, is a combined figure for both point source carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal, which can be very different types of projects, and the breakdown between the two can swing pretty widely depending on the study in question. Overall, though, the research is clear that up to 30% of the emissions reductions at the high end that get the US to net zero could come from carbon management technologies, which means in any scenario, we're going to be capturing and storing or using hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide every single year.
So if eventually we're heading toward 1.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide captured and used or stored annually, that could be as much as a 50x scale up from now to 2050, with a roughly 8x scale up between now and 2030. The good news here is that to get from tens of millions of tons to hundreds of millions of tons, project economics are not the near-term bottleneck for deployment. The technology and policy landscape today has already made over 100 million tons of CO2 economically viable for capture and storage. And as Brad said, a lot of that opportunity is due to the 45Q tax credit, which the Inflation Reduction Act enhanced and expanded. As Brad noted earlier, increased incentives for carbon capture and carbon management in this tax credit will drastically increase the number of feasible projects and the collective mitigation potential across sectors. 45Q provides an $85 tax credit for every metric ton of CO2 captured and permanently stored from industrial sources and electricity generation units, and up to $180 for every ton captured from direct air capture facilities. If you utilize the CO2 or store it through enhanced oil recovery, then 45Q provides a $60 per ton incentive for industrial sources and electricity generation units, and $130 per ton for direct air capture. Another noteworthy change is that the Inflation Reduction Act also lowered the minimum annual capture threshold for all of the facility types by at least an order of magnitude, making smaller facilities eligible and expanding the decarbonization opportunity. Any eligible management project that begins construction prior to 2033 will receive the tax credit for 12 years after they begin operation. 45Q also makes it relatively simple to assess a project's financial viability. If the all-in levelized cost of capturing and storing or using CO2 is lower than the 45Q tax credit value on a per ton basis, then a project could be financially viable. If you can cover your costs and reach your hurdle rate of return under the threshold, you are likely to have a finance-worthy project. Of course, there are industry-specific and project-specific nuances that the report looked at, including other state and federal policies. And sometimes you might be able to get more revenue than just 45Q, but it's a good initial rule of thumb.
And you can see that point that Rory is illustrating laid out in this graphic. So we took a look at a dozen industries and what it costs to capture, transport, and store CO2. That's the little gray bars you see, and what kind of revenue you can expect per ton of CO2 once you do that. So that's the green bars that you see here, to see where carbon management projects might make financial sense today. So maybe let's take the first example of ethanol here that Jigger talked through earlier. The gray bar represents the all-in levelized cost of capturing, transporting, and storing CO2 from an ethanol facility's process emissions. So that's $1 per ton cost, $1 per ton of CO2. Because ethanol's process emissions are practically pure CO2, the cost of capture here is quite low, and most of the all-in cost is driven by how far away the plant is from where the CO2 needs to be transported and how much it costs to store it once it gets there. So at the low end, you're looking at costs of, call it $30 to $35 per ton all in, and at the high end, you're looking at costs of $66 per ton all in. So as we know from Rory just now, because $66 per ton is under $85, that $85 per ton 45Q level, you're already looking at a financially feasible project. The green bar represents the revenues that the project can expect per ton of CO2. So again, you see the solid green bar here for ethanol is the kind of low end range, and that's $85 per ton. And you can see that most of the different industries revenue bars across this whole graphic are just that 45Q value of $85 per ton. But in the case of ethanol, you see there's this tall dotted green line that represents the potential additional revenue that these projects can receive based on the fact that they can sell their low carbon intensity or lower carbon intensity ethanol into the California low carbon fuel standard market that will provide them credits for that lower CI ethanol. So between the $85 per ton 45Q credit and the value of LCFS, ethanol capture projects could be seeing $195 per ton in revenue versus $66 per ton in costs. And so you can see as we look across the whole graphic that in a few industries, so that's ethanol, natural gas processing, capture at a hydrogen facility, steam methane reforming unit, so that covers a lot of fertilizer applications as well, carbon management retrofit projects are pretty firmly in the money. And not coincidentally, that's where you're seeing a lot of development happening today. Now, for other industries, as you move to the right of this graphic, it's not as clear cut. And so it might be a toss-up facility by facility as to whether a given project makes sense. And so in general, for these sectors in the middle, you'd either need to see costs go down or revenue go up to put those in the money, or you need some sort of additional policy intervention or regulation. And it's a similar story for carbon dioxide removal, which is the three examples on the far right here, where costs are substantially higher than for point source capture for the most part. And even though some of these dotted green lines of kind of potential high-end revenue can get quite high, those represent a couple of small one-off purchases that have been seen in the market, but they're not at the kind of volumes that you would need to justify investing in a large carbon dioxide removal facility today. And so stepping back and looking at these green bubbles here above some of these graphics, what we can see is that there's several sectors that are in the money today that get you up to above 100 million tons per year of carbon management that's financially feasible. Again, certainly nothing to sneeze at. But to hit the amount of carbon management we think we'll need for net zero, and that's that 400 to 1,800 million tons per year that we discussed earlier, we're going to need to see improvements in these other areas. So capturing just from the high purity, low cost sources like ethanol and natural gas processing won't be enough.
Thanks, Ramsey. That was a great overview. So what will it actually take to reach hundreds of billions of capital deployment that we need for this sector? The initial challenges we will have to overcome are those that we just talked about. Either costs need to come down or willingness to pay has to go up. We'll see some cost declines in initial project development learnings from deployment and demonstration funding that DOE is managing, which will go a long way to getting first-of-a-kind projects stood up in trickier carbon management applications. Additionally, projects that already have attractive revenues through policy incentives, so the ethanol and natural gas processing that we were talking about earlier, are likely to drive rapid learnings from one project to the next and yield technological and project development improvements that also yield cost declines. And again, increased willingness to pay could come from policy changes, regulation, or voluntary consumer demand for carbon removals or low carbon products.
The report also found that a lack of commercial standardization is an issue facing the carbon management ecosystem. As Brad mentioned, there's lots of parts to this value chain and they all kind of have to come online at the same time. So if you think about a carbon management project, it really requires partnership between asset owners, infrastructure investors, tax equity investors, carbon capture technology providers, the EPC firms who are going to build the thing, the transport providers, the storage providers. And so all of these stakeholders and the partnerships that you need to make them all work together make development a lot more complicated in some cases than other established clean energy technologies like solar or wind. And so standardized project development and financing structures can create significant benefits for carbon capture and certain carbon dioxide removal approaches. Now, incentives from government and efforts by industry to develop hubs or clusters of shared storage and transport infrastructure are already spurring these kind of partnerships that could drive the sort of commercial standardization that aided the scale up of wind and solar. And once these partnerships are formed, publishing the best practices, the lessons learned, the aggregated partnership terms that make them work, particularly from projects that receive government support for first-of-a-kind deployments, the publication of those best practices can really act as a blueprint for future projects and future deployment. As mentioned earlier, we also heard that developers see permitting for carbon storage facilities as a big impediment to developing projects, given the several years it has taken for some of these permits to be issued in the past. Now, as Jigar said, increased resourcing to the EPA and states to manage that Class 6 permit for geologic sequestration of CO2 is expected to ease this as a bottleneck over the next few years.
And again, it's really important to understand that these projects don't exist in a vacuum. So even if a carbon capture or carbon removal project at a given location is theoretically profitable, there isn't transport or storage infrastructure nearby. It won't make sense in a lot of cases for that project to try and develop all those parts of the value chain. Initial build out of large integrated projects in regional aggregations, those hubs and clusters that Brad mentioned, of profitable projects can solve this problem. And we're already seeing this kind of development. And finally, none of this is going to work if the field doesn't develop the ability to have substantive, meaningful engagement between developers and communities that shapes projects to maximize the benefits and minimize potential risks to host communities. Community benefit plans required for CCUS and DAC projects financed through build programs, as Vanessa mentioned, will help establish best practices, provide communities with the resources to advocate and negotiate, and advance public awareness of carbon management technologies.
Great. This was a long slide. Thanks, Rory. Now we'll deep dive on a few of these challenges before we wrap it up here. So on cost, that first issue we mentioned just now. The biggest driver for unit cost, especially for those higher cost of capture applications that were in the yellow portion of the earlier chart, is the capture component of the value chain. And that's also the area where we're likely to see the biggest potential for cost reductions. Now, some of that will be learning by doing with the solvent technologies that have been in use for decades already. And some of it could come from more novel capture technologies like advanced sorbents, membrane technologies, cryogenic approaches that could provide step change improvements for certain project types. Now, as you can see in the middle and the right here, transport and storage make up a comparatively low portion of total all-in cost of carbon management, especially for projects that are lower CO2 concentration in the emission stream, and may have less possibility for significant cost reductions. But for those parts of the value chain, having accessible transport and storage is really a prerequisite for being able to develop a project in the first place. So it's less likely to make or break the economics, but it is going to be a binary toggle on whether it's even feasible to do a given project that a developer might be considering. Now, of course, as opposed to lowering the costs, projects could come into the money by getting more revenue per ton of CO2 that they capture as well. Now, for carbon dioxide removal, that looks like selling removal credits to companies or individuals who want to lower their emissions footprint. For other industries, it could be a technology premium that buyers are willing to pay for a low carbon product. So that's automakers paying more for low embodied emission steel, or state governments preferencing low embodied emissions concrete for their next highway project. And there's really actually demonstrated demand out there, both for carbon dioxide removal credits and for low embodied carbon products, often at pretty high price points that could make these projects work if you knew you were always going to get that premium. So if you look, for instance, at the range of public sale prices for carbon dioxide removal credits, and this is kind of the engineered high permanence carbon dioxide removal credits, that's $500 to $2,000 per ton of carbon dioxide removed. And that would be enough to make a lot of CDR projects pencil if you knew you were always going to be able to secure that revenue for every ton of CO2 that you removed. But the issue, which you can see on the right-hand side of the graphic here, is that demand seldom comes in the form of long-term fixed price offtake agreements, which means that as things stand, developers are going to find it pretty difficult to convince investors that revenues that don't come from that 45Q tax credit are bankable revenues that they can use to underwrite a loan or something like that.
So even once we get all of our project economics sorted out, we'll still need a massive amount of transport and storage infrastructure to make these projects feasible. We think we'll need commercial storage capacity of at least 2 billion tons of CO2 ready by 2030. That's a huge scale up versus what we have access to today. Luckily, as Brad mentioned, we have the geology for this in the US. We have space underground to store probably hundreds of years worth of the United States annual emissions, but we need to actually permit, characterize, and assess and develop storage sites to take advantage of this. FECM's Carbon Safe program can be a big help here, as Brad discussed, and we recently announced 9 new projects that will receive a collective $242 million to develop these facilities. We'll also need a significantly more transportation infrastructure, including pipelines. Today, we have roughly 4,500 miles of CO2 pipelines in the United States. Studies suggest that we'll need to scale that up anywhere from 30,000 to 96,000 miles of CO2 pipelines across the US, depending on facilities and configurations. So between transport and storage, we're looking at a huge need for new infrastructure to unlock carbon management deployment. And while this report specifically looked at pipelines, there are also a variety of other CO2 transport opportunities, including barge, trucking, freight rail, that will be important for specific communities and niche applications.
Great. So this has been a very high-level overview of what we found in the report. There's more detail at liftoff.energy.gov if you haven't heard that URL enough times today. And we'll leave you with this page, which summarizes the report's findings on how we're going to get from here to where we need to be by 2030 and 2050. So from now to 2030, we're expecting to see deployment for the kinds of carbon management projects that are economically feasible today. So that's that 100 million plus tons of carbon dioxide emissions from ethanol, natural gas processing, and some hydrogen cases that are, as Jager said, sort of a no-brainer to develop today. That deployment will help build out the large-scale transport and storage infrastructure that we're going to need down the line. And also in parallel from now till 2030, DOE will be providing demonstration funding and loans to first-of-a-kind carbon management projects in industries with tougher economics. So that's your direct air capture applications, your iron and steel projects, your cement projects that can help bring cost declines in those industries where currently you're at higher costs. Now, from 2030 onwards, those cost declines that we saw from now till 2030 and formalization of markets and policies for carbon dioxide removal and low embodied carbon products can drive broader deployment beyond the stuff with the easiest economics today in 2023. Once these pieces are in place, we expect deployment to accelerate significantly through 2050. And finally, we want to note that the potential benefits from this scale up are pretty massive. This is a $300 to $600 billion capital investment opportunity that could abate over 1 billion tons of emissions in the US each year and create hundreds and thousands of jobs. So achieving full commercial liftoff for carbon management, it's not going to be easy, but the US does have the tools it needs to make it happen. A lot of these tools reside here at the Department of Energy, but we need your help to use them the most effectively. So as Kelly mentioned, these liftoff reports, they're really living documents. This is a first draft, and it's crucial that we get more specific input from you in the private sector as we move out with all our programming that's been outlined today. Like Kelly said, in the US, we are private sector led and government enabled. So we're looking for more detailed input from you all to tell us what you need to deploy carbon management at scale. So please check out the reports at liftoff.energy.gov. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't, what we got right, what we got wrong. We know the space is moving really quickly, and we're looking forward to updating future versions of the report with your input to keep us on track for the hundreds of billions of dollars in capital formation and carbon management that we're going to be seeing by 2050. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us with comments and questions, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much.